Brilliance Audio presents Martin and John by Dale Peck, performed by Andrew Iden. I didn't set out to write this book. I didn't set out to write a book at all, at least not this one. I was working on another novel entirely as my college senior thesis. My advisor on that project was also the teacher in the fiction workshops I was taking to complete my writing minor, and he told me, in no uncertain terms, that I wasn't going to be submitting chapters from my thesis in his workshops. And so, while I churned out the requisite coming-of-age, coming-out novel, I began writing a series of stories on the side. Stories in which I drew on gay archetypes I'd encountered in books, plays, movies, and the news to create a collage of gay life in the late 1980s. The stories were topical, but also unreal. I was a 21-year-old college student, after all, with only borrowed knowledge of the lives I was describing. I wasn't a hustler or a victim, let alone daddy or dandy, John or Queen. I didn't have AIDS and didn't know anyone who did. Hell, I'd only had sex one time, an experience that could be described as perfunctory at best. The stories that grew from this infertile soil sprang up in the margins of my brain while I worked on my real novel and waited for real life to start. I had no plan when I sat down to write the first, Always and Forever, and it wasn't until I began a second, which didn't make the final cut, that I hit on the conceit of reusing the names. Even that was an accident. I'd always had a hard time coming up with names for characters. I borrowed friends' names, or scanned my bookshelves and pulled character or author names more or less at random. Martin came from Martin Luther King Jr., Why We Can't Wait. John from a boy I had a crush on. Henry from Henry James, The Pupil, The Real Thing. Beatrice from Dante's Inferno. Susan was the name of the last girl I ever made out with, and it was in her room that I began the second story. There were two books visible on her bookshelves, a biography of Jim Morrison and a book of his lyrics. I couldn't stand the Doors and refused to acknowledge them, and I plugged along with an ever-growing cast of nameless characters, until finally the unsignified array of he's and hims and she's and hers grew too unwieldy, and I borrowed from myself. Always and Forever, though only a month old, already felt like ancient history, yet even as I assigned its names to a set of new characters, I could see the similarities between the two casts, especially its leads, an innocent boy, an experienced man, a desire that's both mutual and exploitative, and grows in a world where women are cogs in men's lives, necessary but almost invisible. Blue wet paint columns. The last story I wrote for the book was an attempt to acknowledge that. By the time I left Sue's room, I'd lost interest in the story, but had begun to glimpse the shape of a larger project, one in which my inexperience could be generative rather than limiting. The desire to mix up my characters' attributes and reassign them to different contexts was invigorating. Transformations was the first conscious attempt at what I was already calling a Martin and John story, and after that they rolled out of me at the rate of 1 or 2 a month. Still, they remained tangential to the novel I was working on, a game I was playing, an assignment I had to fulfill, and I didn't take the time to wonder if there was anything more to them until after I'd turned in my thesis and realized now I had to write another book. I was terrified. I had no clue how to turn these stories into a book and no idea what else I might work on, and so, more by default than anything else, I kept churning out material in that first summer after college. The Search for Water, 3 Night Watchmen, and, as a first-year MFA student, Driftwood, The Gilded Theater. But the stories came more and more slowly as I realized I'd exhausted the possibilities of the conceit, or at any rate my ability to exploit it. By then I had a mess of a dozen stories, none of which was really finished, and no idea how to put them together. It was my friend Bruce who saved me, and saved the book.